There are many strange happenings in the wild country of British Columbia, and none more so than the singular event of coming into contact with a Sasquatch. In the indigenous tongue of a native people, the males are known as the Bukwas, and the females are named Sanakwa. The people who seek them out are known as Sasquatch researchers, and the following reports are from the files of one such man, Canada's preeminent Sasquatch researcher and seeker of the truth, Thomas Steenberg.
Sasquatch, I mean, everyone's gone there to have a burger or something, right? Great place, but it's called Sasquatch Inn for a reason, because this is the area behind it, and up north along the west side of Harrison Lake, where the name Sasquatch comes from, as I was saying earlier. This is where it all began. This is where the non-First Nation people of Canada got their name for the creature from the Chehalis people, Sasquatch. And of course, the Chehalis people adopted the Sasquatch as the symbol of their nation. And you'll find it go up and down. You'll see this symbol all up and down. Personally, I think it's one of the best ones they got going. Yes, dear. All the cookies were gone?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it was the Sasquatch or something.
There weren't any guys around.
My grandpa was working.
Yeah.
The jackal rose and
Yeah.
a big rock broke, so probably couldn't see the
Well, I'll tell you one thing for sure. There have been stories of Sasquatch taking food off picnic tables, campers, that kind of thing. It's happened before.
like Yogi Bear.
Not as friendly. Yeah. Yeah, there have been stories of them shading campers, looking in windows, things like that. Yeah, that kind of thing. Like you were telling me earlier, you thought you may have seen one outside your window. Does your property back onto forest areas?
Well, back when my grandma and grandpa's their house is way far back.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a really, like, you can barely see through it. The trees are really thick.
Mm-hmm.
So one day, my grandma and grandpa, we went up there.
Mm-hmm.
We found really hard, but no footprints.
You saw footprints?
No, we didn't.
No, okay. Well, if you ever do, I'll just tell you, like I tell everybody, don't go anywhere in British Columbia without a camera. Never. Anywhere. Always carry. I don't care what type of camera it is, always have one with you. You're in a picnic area and a campground and you have to get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to go to the outhouse, take your camera with you. You know, because that's the kind of thing and that's the kind of time it will happen. You know, and of course, if you don't get a picture, you're just another person who says he saw a Sasquatch when you have thousands of those. Now, the man you're seeing here, his name is J.W. Burns, John Wilson Burns. He was a teacher on the Chehalis Reserve in the 1920s. He was a Caucasian man, and he got a job teaching in the First Nation school on the Chehalis Reserve in the 1920s. He was also a government Indian agent. Now, he became very friendly and got to know a lot of the First Nation people there, and they got to the point where they trusted him, and they told him things. And he heard stories about this thing that they call Saskaheli. Saskaheli. All depends how you want to pronounce it. Which they basically described as, they said, was a large race of hair-covered people that they themselves had driven into the mountains many generations before in battle. And that every now and then you would see their fires on the top of Moore's Mountain. And they had a a few stories of Sasquatch, especially, the females, to be avoided and dreaded. One story of a local lady in 1871 who claimed as a young woman she had been captured and spent a number of years or a number of months with a family of them up in a cave in Morris Mountain, who she later escaped, gave birth to a hair-covered child, which died very soon afterwards, and she lived the rest of her life until she passed away of old age in the early 1930s. And that's another one of the classic tales from that area. But J.W. Burns, he was a prolific writer. He used to write articles for local publications in Canada about life in the First Nation reserves and the areas and their culture and their legends and their oral history. And he wrote an article for Maclean's magazine that appeared on April 1st, 1929, that was entitled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants. And like I said, he misspelled the word, he mispronounced the word, he called it Sasquatch. And that name caught on with the non-First Nation population in Canada, and it's been known as Sasquatch here ever since. So our name precedes the American name Bigfoot by a good 30 years. Wow, 1929, 1950, yeah, 30 years. That's how the name came about. A misprint and a mispronunciation by this man. There's the Three Amigos. But we also have another classic tale that got a lot of attention when it happened, but it was so far back no one really knew what they were dealing with. The man in this picture, I was there, I was holding camp. And Bill Miller, an American friend of mine who does a lot of research on very blunt, who now lives in Chilliwack, and a fellow named John, who was the curator of the museum in Yale, British Columbia. You all know where Yale is. Just thought, okay. Now here's the story of what happened in Yale. Today Yale is a town of barely 80 people. Barely 80 people. You blink, you'll miss it. As you go through, as you drive north through the Fraser Canyon, But in the 1880s, when the gold rush was on, Yale had a population of 18,000. It was a boom town. It was as far as the old steam wheelers on the Fraser River could get. They couldn't go up the river any further than that. So the old wagon road that was basically built on the side and was considered a wonder of the world in those days was built right in the cliffs north of Yale, going all the way up through the valley. Now in 1884, like I said, it was a boom town, and it was a bad town. It was a terrible place. Violence. It was a Wild West town. A lot of people like to think that somehow the Canadian West was more civilized than the American one. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. In many ways, it was much worse. There wasn't a week that went by in Yale town without a gunfight, a stabbing, a murder, you name it, it happened. So when something like this caught attention in 1884, it was only, by word of mouth, very popular in the community for maybe a week, then there'd be another gunfight or another stabbing, and people would forget about it. But in 1884, the Victoria Times columnist published an article. What is it? In that article, they described the capture of a creature that was found lying unconscious along the newly built railway line that they were building right on the old wagon road, the Trans-Canada rail line, which was still 1 year away from completion. It was still a big gap near Revelstoke at this time, so you couldn't get across the country on it yet. It was still 1 year away from completion. But this section was finished. And a train coming down, heading towards Yaletown, saw this thing laying unconscious right around here somewhere. Between the cliff, the track, and if you were to look to the left here, it's a sheer drop into the Fraser River, which is a torrent, no matter what time of year it is at this point. And that's tunnel number 4. And according to the article, as the train was approaching tunnel number 4, they saw this figure lying unconscious on the tracks. They brought the train to a halt, and they blew the whistle, and whatever it was sort of revived, and it started trying to climb the cliff, and the men all gave chase. And they got hung up on a ledge. Who knows which ledge, but it was a low ledge, like right around here with that. But some of the men managed to get up above it, and they started throwing rocks down on it, knocking him unconscious, apparently, where he fell back down to the ground by the tracks. And they immediately trusted it up, tied it up, and threw it in the bags and on the rail cars and headed into the town of Yale. The creature was allegedly removed from the train at the train yards just on the extreme north end of town. Almost the whole town was gathered in the main station to get a look at this thing, but in order to avoid the crowd, they took it off at the rail train yards on the north end of town, and they put it in a cage. But Dr. Harrington, the town doctor, examined the thing, and he had no idea what he was dealing with. I mean, they said it was rather chimpanzee-like, but it had long legs like a human being. It stood just over 4 feet tall, had extremely massive arms, could bend thick pieces of wood and twist them in half, and a man could drank milk with an absolute relish. Ate all the vegetable the man would get it. They withheld meat from it because the doctor was afraid it might make them wild. But as I said, they had no idea what they were dealing with. Remember, the term Sasquatch was still years in the future, and this is 1884. So the Victorian Times columnist published this article, and the article is, "What is it?" And he said, because, the racism of the time and stuff, they just caught a wild Indian, and they wrote it off that way. They caught a weird bear, or they've caught this, or they've caught that, and a lot of people later on thought the whole Jacko story, which is the name that was given to the creature, Jacko, was perhaps a bit of tabloid journalism, which was common in regular newspapers in those days, especially when it was a slow news time. Imagine the late 1800s, it was quite a few days like that. However, newspapers usually didn't share tabloid stories in those days. And I took a look through the archives, and I found in the Calgary archives an article from the Winnipeg Free Press at the same time that basically repeated the story. So that's two different papers from Western Canada repeating the same tabloid story, and that usually didn't happen in those days. And since then, a couple of colleagues from the United States, like one from Colorado and another one from what they call the Oregon Territory, they sent out pictures telling the story of Jacko, the creature captured near Yale, BC. And again, how would the Americans hear of a tabloid story up in Canada those days when it took weeks for anyone to hear about anything? But the biggest problem with Jacko is we don't know what happened to him. The men who captured him, where it was reported, were going to put the creature on display in a sort of carnival-type atmosphere and make their fortune. And the only two ways to get out of there in those days was, one, go to Fort Vancouver and take a steamship, or go cross the border into the United States and go across the continent on their transcontinental railway, which was finished by that time. But we don't know. Famous First Nation chief, Chief Kitsilano, said he saw a creature being displayed in the Vancouver area in 1884 that he believed was Jacko. But I have not been able to find any media or any mention of such a display in 1884 in Vancouver. You'd think there would be. There's also the story of the nuns up at the nunnery in Bishop Cove that were handed this creature, and the first thing they did was shave all his hair off, and he immediately died. No way to confirm that story one way or the other. There's the popular theory introduced by the late Grover Krantz that P.T. Barnum, you've all heard that name, Barnum and Bailey Circus. He was the biggest showman in the North American continent at this time, and a freak show. They had the Siamese twins. They had the famous Tom Thumb, the midget. They had all kinds of characters like this. And it just so happens that same year, 1884, a few months after the so-called Jacko capture occurred, he started advertising a new attraction called Joe the Dog-Faced Boy. And Grover had the theory that perhaps Jojo, the original Jojo, was this creature. But for some reason, P.T. Barnum, after 2 months of advertisement, he never published any pictures. And all of a sudden, Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy was removed from all this advertising for a period of about 8 years. And P.T. Barnum, being a man who never let a good name lie, he used the name again and published pictures, only this time it was obviously a picture of a young man with that rare affliction where hair grows all over the body and stuff like that. And he had him dressed up as a Russian Cossack, and there's a story about how he was found raiding camps in the Crimea, etc., etc., etc. I mean, P.T. Barnum's favorite line was, "There's a sucker born every minute." He's the man who tied a fish to a monkey's cadaver and called it the Fiji mermaid. You know, that's what he was. This was P.T. Barnum. And so we all moreover wondered, what was the first JoJo? I mean, did he get his hands? I mean, if there was one man in North America at that time who would have paid good money for something like this, it was P.T. Barnum. However, if the thing died on P.T. Barnum, I wouldn't stop him. He would have probably stopped it and he'd put it on display anyway. There's no record of anything. So we don't know. That's the biggest problem with the Jocko story. We don't know what happened to Jocko. Some people say he probably died on transit, being taken to Europe or Asia on ship. And when animals died on board ship in those days, they wasted no time in throwing them overboard. There's just no, he disappeared from history. So we don't know what happened to Jocko. But that's another great classic tale from Western Canada here. And of course, one going all the way back to 1815, David Thompson crossing the Rocky Mountains the first time near Jasper. Made a note in his journal about these large footprints he found in the snow that his First Nation guides were terribly afraid of. Now, whether or not they were large bipedal tracks, we don't know. He didn't mention claw. A lot of people thought they were just a huge bear track. We'll have no idea because we weren't there to see them with them. And of course, no pictures were taken. We just have this description from his journal. And of course, that was the same year of the 8th camp, 1924, Albert Osman. He was the man who claimed he was kidnapped, spent a week living with a family of these things up around Toba Inlet. Have you all heard that story? That was 1924. Albert Osman was a young man. He got dropped off by boat. They headed to Toba Inlet after a few days. I'm going through this real quick. A few days, something hanging around his camp, disturbing his stuff. He decided to get into a sleeping bag fully dressed. He put his boots and his rifle in the sleeping bag, and he was determined to catch whatever it was that was going through his stuff in there. But he fell asleep. When he woke up, something was picking him up in his sleeping bag like a sack of potatoes. And it threw him over his shoulder and walked off with him. He said he was in that sleeping bag nearly dying of suffocation for almost 4 hours as it went over hill and dale, carrying him, sometimes dragging him along the ground. And when he was dumped out, he found himself in a family of 5 of these creatures. The old man, he called it, the one that picked him up, the one he called the old lady, and actually 4, excuse me, and there was one young male one and one young female one there. The young male one was very curious about him. The young female just hid from him all the time, just would peek out at him from behind bushes. And he was eventually dropped off in this horseshoe-shaped canyon that had a creek run through this very narrow entrance. He saw no signs of tool use or anything. The only thing he said is they basically had what looked like vegetation mats they slept on, which he thought was more of a case of layers and layers of vegetation being crushed together rather than anything being woven. And, well, by happy coincidence, the creature that picked him up in the sleeping bag also decided to pick up his backpack and drop in there. So he had some cans of food and stuff there. He said they never tried to harm him, but they wouldn't let him go. And he had no idea what they wanted of him. So he realized after a while that they were impersonating him. He'd make his own tea and coffee and meals by the fire, and a fire he made, and he had this tin of snuff, which is kind of like chewing tobacco. And he'd take a little pinch of it. And when he called the old man, I would have picked him up and look at him out of curiosity. Take another pinch, snip, and then the big male Sasquatch grabbed the whole can and down the whole contents and swallowed it. He said it wasn't long before that thing was grabbing its head and rolling over, obviously sick and in distress. And then it grabbed his coffee can, his coffee cup, and it downed all that, browns and all. Just to try to relieve the taste it had in its mouth or whatever. and it got even sicker. So the others were paying attention to what he called the old man, writhing on the ground. Osmond grabbed his pack, grabbed his rifle, and ran out the entrance to this cabin. The one he called the old lady did try to chase him. He turned and he fired one shot over her head, but she retreated. Now, according to Albert Osmond, he spent one night and one day wandering through the trees when he heard the sound of a logging operation in the distance. And by the time he came out, he was so dehydrated and in bad shape, he didn't tell them what had happened to him. All he said was he told them he was a prospector and he got lost. And the logging company took care of him at the camp for a day or two before they sent him back by steamboat back to Vancouver. And Albert Osmond kept the story to himself until all the publicity about the Sasquatch came out in 1957 when British Columbia was celebrating its 100th bicentennial. And there were stories going on in the press about Sasquatch. And he just said, well, I was living a week with the family, these darn things. He didn't use the word darn, but he did what I mean. And he was interviewed by John Green and Rennie DeHaden and Iron T. Sanderson, and he, fortunately, not too long after he came up, he wrote it all down in a scribbler, the whole story. And his attitude was that, you can believe me or not, I really don't care. Maclean's magazine offered him money to publish the story. He said, no, you can publish it, you don't need to pay me anything. This is what happened, this is what I saw, this is what I experienced. If you believe me, fine. If you don't, I don't care. And he maintained that attitude to the day he died. He died in 1973. He lived his whole life in Fort Langley. You know, I had an idea. I mean, I said, how do you try to find information on something like this if it was true? Because he came out in the Salmon Arm Shell Inlet. Well, if you look at a map, the distance between the head of Tobin and that area, he had to cross 3 mountain ranges to get there. You know, that sounded real strange.
You had to cross Seashell Inlet to get there, too.
Yeah, unless he went around the northern tip of it.
You would have done that in a week.
Yeah, I know. But it all comes down to how far did this thing carry him when it first picked him up. He said it was moving the whole time. He was being dragged over hill and there while in the sleeping bag. But that's a heck of a distance. So I had the idea back in the early 80s when I was running the Timber News. Did logging companies in 1924 keep logbooks? You know, did they make logbooks of their daily activities? So some did, a lot didn't. So I looked in the office. McMillan and Boydell was still going in those days. They were in the area. There were other companies in the area. They had logbooks of other companies in the area. I just wondered, did any logbook mention that their men coming across a lost prospector in the Salmon Arm, a shelled inlet, on a summer day in 1924? Just to see. Of the 3 logbooks I looked at, none of them said anything about coming across a lost prospector in 1924 in the Salmon Arm shelled inlet. However, I also found out that even though I looked at the logbooks of 3 companies, there were 40 logging operations in the Salmon Arm area at that time. So the odds are he came out and got picked up by somebody who wasn't keeping logbooks is indeed possible. All I know is I couldn't prove it. And I had another idea. In his original story, he said an elderly native gentleman dropped him off by boat at the head of Tobin Inlet. Well, I always wondered, what did this elderly native gentleman do when he went back in 3 weeks? He was supposed to come back in 3 weeks and pick him up. What did he do when he couldn't find him? Did he tell the RCMP? Did he make a report of some kind? But all efforts to look into that came to a dead end. Most specific there was. Hell, most of the police officers I talked to said they had no idea. Any record of something like that happening in 1924 would have been long lost by now. So again, another classic tale. But because if you can't really follow up on any of this stuff, there's no way to check on it.
Okay, dear listener, that about wraps it up for now. My name is Jerry Matthews. You can reach me at yellowcoyote@talus.net. Thank you for your interest, and until the next time, keep searching.